I'm very pleased to be moderating this panel today, really looking in depth at some of the lessons from early regulated markets across the country, including California, Oregon, and Colorado. Again, Lindsay Robinson, California Cannabis Industry Association. So I'm going to pass this over to Kaitlin first off.
Hi, I'm Kaitlin Urso. I work for the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. I have been with CDPHE for 10 years in January. Yeah, it's been a while. I have a mechanical engineering degree. I have played several roles at CDPHE, from writing actual regulations. Writing drinking water regulations was one of my first roles, to doing community outreach projects. The role that I'm in now is very dynamic and interesting. I'm basically a free environmental consultant for all small businesses in Colorado. I personally happen to specialize in craft brewing and cannabis. A lot of people laugh and say, like, is that your real job? It is. Those are two small business sectors in Colorado that are large growth industries that both use a lot of environmental resources just inherent in their process. And so that's kind of the nexus of my role, and really I'm here to just help make the cannabis industry more environmentally friendly.
And I have to follow that. So my name is Jesse Peters. I was a co-founder of EcoFirma Farms, which was a cultivation operation up in Oregon. We sold that business in June of 2018, and at the time that we sold it, we were cultivating indoor cannabis for $189 a pound. We were doing it on 100% renewable energy, and we were almost carbon neutral. I since then have founded Mantis Growth Investments. We are an MSO consolidating companies primarily across the West Coast, and I was a founding member of the Oregon Cannabis Association and still a board member there.
I'm Gary Corlett. I'm an engineer with Southern California Edison. I work in our energy analysis and customer outreach organization. I work with our business customers with energy efficiency, and I've been doing that for about 10 years. Through that time, I've been working with our agricultural customers, and for the last 4 years, I've been dedicated to indoor horticulture.
Okay, so let's dig in. As many of you know, if you operate in California, we have local and state level laws that govern what you can do in various jurisdictions across the state, and it is a very complicated patchwork. We have some communities that are quite friendly to cannabis and are regulating manufacturing, distribution, retail, cultivation, and some where it's a complete ban, de facto prohibition. So I'd love to talk first off with Gary just a little bit about what you see in the challenges, particularly in Coachella Valley, and what some of the main factors that you focus on currently.
Yeah, so the main issues that we have in the Coachella Valley originally were that our infrastructure wasn't capable of providing the power that's required for these facilities. The initial investments there were made in desert hot springs, and the city, in their wisdom when they were doing this, decided that they wanted to make a cannabis business park. And they did that in an area of desert that was zoned for 5-acre single-family homes. And suddenly we have actually about 12 different facilities there in about 30 acres. So, and each of them takes about 1 to 5 megawatts. So that's the same as having a megawatt that serves about 750 homes in California. So that's the same as having between 750 and 3,000 homes on a 5-acre lot.
We kind of jump on this from a lot of topics. I think this is a really kind of important one to look at, whereas California and Oregon kind of did the same thing, right? We have this free market for licensing, which I am a huge fan of, because whereas some people say it's a race to the bottom, I would say it's a race to be more efficient. And if you are looking at building a cultivation facility in desert hot springs, and your exit strategy, hopefully that you have one, is to be acquired by someone else in the future, I can tell you personally, as a West Coast MSO operator, I am not looking at your company. We're looking at potential for interstate commerce when we move forward in the world. California and Oregon are known for growing a large quantity of the whole country's cannabis. In the north, where you can get power for better prices, where there's renewable resources. And so, as much as I appreciate all of it, I think it's, when you hear these numbers, not only coming from a power perspective or coming from an environmental standpoint, but you have to think of it economically as well. What is your exit strategy? What is your plan? I mean, everybody who goes to work every day has an exit strategy. It's to retire. So you've got an exit strategy if you haven't thought about it yet, and that's either that you're going to retire from this company and give it to someone else, which means it needs to substantially survive through what is going to be a very difficult and tumultuous market over the next 2 decades, or you need to think of where it's at and be really efficient with it. And so I think that listening to these things and heeding warnings to thinking of what you're doing moving forward is crucially important at conferences like this.
I think they covered it pretty well, but I think the only thing that I have to add is, coming from Colorado's perspective and being one of the most mature markets in the country, we learned a lot of hard lessons really early on, and we also there was a lot of fear around being the first to legalize in the way that we did. And so all of our regulatory structure was centered around safety, security, and no diversion to the black market. Environmental and efficiency standards were not considered. That's why we have this situation in Colorado where most of our cannabis is grown indoors under lock and key, and it creates a lot of environmental detriment. So.
Yeah, and I think, we, as going through the process with California over the last several years, we have tried to look at Colorado as a roadmap on what worked and what didn't. And I have to say a lot of California regulators did not really heed a lot of the warnings that we saw from Colorado and have implemented regulations in California that are proving to be problematic. And I think one of the things that we talked a bit about earlier, and we really also wanted this to just be a conversation amongst us and then obviously open it up to all of you and be able to learn from each other, is the stress on the grid. And I think that you're seeing a really dramatic case of that down in the desert areas. So can you expand a little bit about that, and if you've gone through, if there's been any significant complications that have in some ways affected people's businesses or their ability to maintain?
Yeah, so Desert Hot Springs is actually one of the better examples of what we've been able to do to accommodate. They're real close. We have wind power that's out in that area. It's designated for other parts of the grid. But it means that we have a transmission level substation in that area. So we were able to expand an existing distribution substation to provide a little bit of power, and we were able to bring power in from other areas to support the facilities there. The other extreme to that is California City, where that's a community that's basically was a retirement community. There's no industry to speak of there. There was a large housing tract that was planned and power was put in for it, but it never developed. So that allowed us to pull some power. But the major issue is that they again put all of their cannabis facilities in a cannabis business park. That business park was located half mile or so from the nearest distribution line, and not only for electricity but also for gas and water. And so they basically, nobody out there has power or any other utilities there because of that. So that's the other extreme.
That's pretty extreme.
Yeah. So.
For those who aren't familiar with it, and we're kind of newer into the California market, so I apologize that I'm not completely up to speed on all California regulations, so no one's allowed to hold me to any of this. Disclaimer. But no, there's a green zone up around Arcata where California established some regulations that removed the taxation and basically said, for lack of a lot more red tape, apply for a license, pay the fee, and it's yours. We're not going to play the game of continuing to look at regulation upon regulation upon regulation. And so, of course, for me, looking at MSOs, this is a giant flag waving around in the sky that says, come buy my company. Because if you think about the way the California market works, and some of the things that, in my opinion, we're starting to see as an issue in California is you're looking at as everybody makes regulation, and we spoke about this earlier, Santa Barbara just came out and said that you can cultivate cannabis, and we are doing that there. Oh, by the way, wait, you can't dry it. It's a big fire hazard. What was your plan with all of it when we got done growing it? So you look at this regulation, and now we've got to figure out what we're going to do with it. Okay, we're going to turn it to fresh frozen? Are we going to ship it to a drying facility? You know, when I send it to the processor, I need to pay a cultivation tax. And then when the processor sends it to the manufacturer to package it, they need to pay a manufacturing tax. And then when you send it to the distributor, you pay a distribution tax. And then they give it to the delivery or the retail where you pay a tax. And now I'm spending $62 for a gram of cannabis that's been handled 47 times in a bag that I can't see or potentially even recycle, when my friend Rick has been selling me bags for 40 bucks that now grows like 18 different strains. I love all of them, and it's still 40 bucks. Why don't we have a giant market in California? I feel like we're figuring that out. And so when you look at the green zone, you look at this space where I don't have to pay any of that tax in the middle. So if we get really efficient with those locations, and I don't pay all that tax in the middle, and we vertically integrate ourselves throughout there, maybe we can start getting a product to consumers at a competitive price and start getting the unregulated market to want to come into the regulated market. That's the goal, right?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that there are a lot of lessons that we're learning in California real time. We obviously have, the local access and local control has been a huge component of how California has regulated cannabis, which has turned some communities into much friendlier zones than others. And then even within those communities, they have green zones or areas that are much more friendly, but oftentimes we've heard from our members that those areas are not necessarily conducive for running businesses. And so I think, we touched a little bit about on that with access and just overtaxing of the grid, especially, and then really just making sure that these businesses are kind of, grouped into a certain area, I think is beneficial in certain ways, but also problematic in others. And so we're, like I said, trying to figure all of this out in real time in California, and it's basically like running a small country, or even a medium-sized country, really. And we love overregulation. So one of the things that I thought was really interesting about what Kaitlin said earlier is, and I'd love for you to elaborate on your 30 different conversations that you had.
Yeah, so one of the things the roles that I play is I am researching the air quality impacts of the cannabis industry, something that not a lot of people are talking about, besides the secondary impacts of power generation. But inherent within the cultivation and processing is air emissions. Terpenes are volatile organic compounds. They're not just an odor nuisance. Volatile organic compounds, I have a slide on this, but I'll show it to you guys in a little bit. Volatile organic compounds are ozone precursors. Ozone is toxic for us to breathe. It's an issue that's pretty big in Colorado. And with the way that we legalized marijuana in Colorado, not only did we force it all indoors, but we zoned it industrial, and we put all these other regulatory restrictions on setbacks from schools and other cannabis businesses. I mean, there's a lot of regulation surrounding where you can grow marijuana in Colorado. And what it did is it forced about 60 to 70% of the cultivation into our metropolitan area. The reason why that's important is not only are we stressing our grid, but we're stressing our municipal drinking water supply, our wastewater effluent, our air quality, because ozone is VOCs and combustion emissions combined. So when you put it in the city, that's where all of our power plants are, that's where all of our traffic is, that's where all of our combustion activities are. And so it's just compounding issues with the way that we legalized and forcing, what should be an agricultural commodity into a literally manufacturing environment.
Yeah, and I think one of the items that we had touched on earlier as well is that in you having conversations on the regulatory level in terms of air quality, comparing Colorado to California, I'd love for you to highlight an example of how difficult it is to regulate here.
Yeah, so in Colorado, we have one Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. California has many, many, many. Just from an air pollution standpoint, I believe they have over 26 air pollution districts that all make up, one big CARB, California Air Resource Board. And so, when I am working with other states and other entities to try to educate them on these issues and inform them about how to make smart policy, it's really difficult when you go into a state like California to advise them, and you've got this whole patchwork of not only different regulations per area, you have different regulatory bodies, you have different perspectives, you have, it's a lot. So, what takes one phone call to educate another state, like maybe, Michigan or Oregon, takes about 30 phone calls to educate California, and it's all piecemeal.
Yes, they don't all talk to each other. Surprising. Well, maybe this would be a good time for us to segue into your PowerPoint, because I think that will generate more conversation amongst the panelists, but then also is just a ton of information that we hope you all will comment on as well. And you need this.
Yes. Our first two slides we're going to share as a group, and we're really going to focus on the environmental impacts of the cannabis industry and not just the energy impacts. I know that this conference is really focused on the energy impacts. If you want to click it for me, I can just cue you. But I want to point out the other environmental impacts. And so just inherent in the cultivation and processing of cannabis, there's many environmental impacts. So we've talked about energy, but what about water? And whether you're growing indoor or outdoor, there's water impacts. In an indoor environment, you're taking the drinking water supply that's treated to drinking water standards and putting that towards an agricultural commodity. That has a lot of energy impacts. It takes a lot of energy to treat that water. All right, we got it. And so there's also in an outdoor environment, indoor or outdoor, you also have a lot of irrigation systems, and you need to be efficient with those, and so that kind of gets at water efficiency. In an outdoor environment, you got runoff and erosion issues, and then also indoor, you've got wastewater effluent. So you're putting all those pesticides, nutrients, you got to be aware of what you're putting down the drain, because those wastewater municipalities that weren't traditionally set up to support a large influx of indoor agriculture are now taking on that burden. There's a lot of waste from the industry. Plant waste, universal waste, like your lighting, your ballast, your electronic waste. And then there's also hazardous waste, your leftover solvents, cleaning supplies, chemicals, those types of things. As I mentioned, air emissions, terpenes are volatile organic compounds. I got a really great slide to explain why that's important. And then also just, be aware of the chemical use associated with cultivation. You've got pesticides, fertilizers, solvents. In an outdoor grow environment, you also got a lot of rodenticides. So just kind of being aware of this inherent in the process, whether you're indoor or outdoor, there is a environmental burden that you're putting on the community, and we all need to be smarter about how we run our businesses to reduce that burden. So I'm going to turn it over to these two guys to comment on environmental impacts of cannabis cultivation.
Yeah, I look at a lot of these, and obviously we look at environmental efficiencies, right? But I also look at economic efficiencies. And you start looking at these things, and you look at, for example, water treatment, irrigation, runoff, erosion, wastewater effluent, and you start thinking about, if I'm in a facility where I pay a water bill and I pay a sewage bill, and eventually I'm told I need to start separating out my fertilizer, which should be something I'm doing on my own, you start looking at a cost associated to that. And that cost association breaks down to price per gram. That is going to be a cost onto how much it costs me to cultivate, hands down. And then I look at my competitor, who says in agricultural land, they're on a well, they have literally dug a hole and got native plants that all of their runoff goes into and cooks off all of that, which is a fancy bioswale, but in the end it's cooking off all your nutrient that is, if you're using too much nutrient. I have just erased that cost from my bottom line. So now we're competing. And this goes down Plant waste. Am I in ag land where I can put a fence around it, put a camera on it, and I can let it compost, and then I can reuse that compost and then save myself on fertilizer? Or am I using a dumpster? Am I having to pay to have it removed through waste?
Are you having to mix it with 50% non-marijuana waste before you put it in the dumpster?
Right. And as we go through this, chemical use, pesticides, automation, to understand that we're using the exact amount of fertilizer that we need to use at the exact times, under the exact conditions, per strain. The research that we talked about yesterday, when you're a cultivator, and you know, we're all kind of used to it. You've got these cultivators, all of us, I've been guilty of it 1,000 times. Well, we can figure that out later because the margins are there. 2 years ago, I had a conversation with a cultivator from here in California who said we get $2,800 a pound. That's not going to change for at least 3 years. I don't care what my price per pound is. I haven't called him lately, but I got a feeling that that is not his statement today. So you look at all of those pieces and you think to yourself, well, I have time. I have time to get to it. Or I need to be able to produce a facility to be able to do that. And these are decisions that need to be made now while you have the time, while those margins are there.
No matter what your equipment says, it can tell you it's 99% efficient. At the end of the day, you have humans running these machines. It's not going to be 99% efficient. Think about, even when you take the plant material out of the system after it's gone through its, its regenerative evaporative process, that those inherent within that plant material is still going to be solvent. And so that solvent's going to continue to off gas. That those solvents, butane, propane, ethanol, those are all volatile organic compounds. And again, I'll talk about the importance of VOCs in a second. Also CO2 releases, you can use pressurized CO2 for extraction as well. There's CO2 releases from that. And also, worth noting in the indoor cultivation environment, there's a lot of supplemental CO2 that's used within that environment as well. Then once that solvent is spent, it doesn't last forever, right? It goes bad. We have to dispose of it as hazardous waste. And so those are other environmental impacts. And then being aware of plant waste too. There's all these regulations out there, especially in Colorado. We have a 50-50 waste mixing rule where you have to mix it with 50% non-marijuana waste before it can leave the facility. That doubles our landfill footprint. And honestly, we don't have a lot of issues with people stealing trash, marijuana trash. So that's something I'd like to see a change to that. And we have seen a positive regulatory change. As of January 1st in Colorado, we now have a rule where the composting truck, if it rolls up under surveillance and the dumpster's under lock and key of the plant waste, by way of the truck taking that dumpster and putting it in the back of the truck, that's your 50-50 waste compliance point, and that's acceptable. That's really important because that also makes composting more accessible for cultivators because you pay per pound to compost. So if you're doubling the amount that you have to compost, you're doubling the amount you have to pay to compost. So just things to be aware of, that it doesn't just stop at the cultivation environment, that it's also processing, and then distribution as well, with all of the packaging and distribution. So.
Yeah, I think that California's had a hard time learning these lessons from Colorado, especially around the environmental waste piece. So I think having a few years advance on California has really shaped and informed the regulations that you're now dealing with. And again, we're a larger state, but I would love to hear maybe a little bit on Oregon, on how things are going up there with waste management.
Waste management in Oregon has been... it's been, I would like to say, easy in the sense of it hasn't been over-regulated. But that being said, when we look at processors, and honestly, there's a lot of stuff that Oregon is starting to look to Colorado for. A lot of the studies that are being put out now, what we're talking about right now, this is going to be sensible for us to turn to when it comes to waste management. And as far as farm waste management, we're looking more towards, regulators in Oregon are concerned that there's diversion potentially happening through waste. So when Oregon looks at waste, it looks more on the regulatory side of diversion. That is rapidly going to change probably across the industry, but especially in Oregon and looking to Colorado on the processor side. Because just the volatile chemicals, the VOCs, the look towards what is happening as we can refine that down with processors, I believe that Oregon's going to turn to a higher regulatory stature there. And that's obviously going to affect pricing. So It's another one of those things talking about where if you're trying to be economically viable, building a C1, D1 facility, even though you're not required to, and always trying to be, have ingenuity in trying to decide how you're going to handle waste with a moral structure that not only goes behind environmentally friendly, but also considering what could happen regulatory-wise in the future and being prepared for that.
Oh, Ashley.
Trade you.
We're juggling all this. All right, so I'm going to go into a little bit more Colorado-specific issues and some of the work that I'm doing, just very briefly. And I say that because this could literally be a 3-hour conversation, and I'm going to do my best to keep it very short. So why are VOCs important? We mentioned that VOCs are coming off of the plants as they grow in the form of terpenes, right? We've got myrcene, pinene, limonene, terpinolene. Those are all being released into the atmosphere, and those are volatile organic compounds. It happens to be that the terpene emission profile associated with cannabis is highly reactive for ozone formation. So when VOCs go up into the atmosphere, they react with other types of pollution. Those other types of pollution are specifically nitrogen oxide. We get nitrogen oxide from combustion sources, cars, power plants, oil and gas activity. Anytime you're burning something, it could be agricultural burns, it could be wood burning activities. If there's combustion, there's going to be nitrogen oxide. Again, really important for Colorado. We are not meeting EPA health standards for ambient ozone concentrations already, and then we regulated cannabis in a way that we forced everybody into our metropolitan area, co-located next to all of our sources of nitrogen oxide. What we don't know right now is how many pounds of VOCs are emitted per pound of cannabis grown. That's a question that I'm trying to answer with my research currently. I've got a research grant through Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment where I'm actually collecting air quality samples at commercial cultivation environments to answer this question of how many pounds of VOCs are emitted per pound of marijuana grown. Once we're able to answer that question, we have really good plant count tracking production tracking in Colorado through our marijuana enforcement division. So then we can couple it, that data with, okay, how many pounds of marijuana are grown in the state and where? What are all the other sources of nitrogen oxide and VOCs? And really at the end of the day come to how much of our total ozone problem in Colorado is attributed to the cannabis industry. Some people, they hear my research and they think that maybe I'm picking on cannabis or something like that. Definitely not. We do this for all regulated industries in Colorado. We want to know what everyone's air quality impact is in Colorado. And typically when you get new industries that come online, EPA, the Federal Environmental Protection Agency, would be the one to do this type of research to universally establish what we call emission factors, pounds of VOCs produced per pound of marijuana grown. EPA is not going to do that for you guys. So Colorado is stepping in and trying to fill that gap in knowledge for other states. I'm not the first one to research this issue. There is other studies that are out there. However, when Colorado looked at those studies, we didn't feel they were robust enough to base, any regulatory or policy decisions on. It's also worth noting that cannabis is a agricultural process, especially the cultivation, not the manufacturing, but the cultivation is an agricultural process, and agricultural processes are exempt from air quality regulations. So at the end of the day, this is just fact finding. We want to know what the impact is. Other states and Canada do plan to make regulatory policy decisions based on this research. So something to know about.
And mine was only going back to the last point, like we talked about earlier. This opens up a space eventually to start looking at incentives to get away from industrial zones that could create this ozone from VOCs, right? Because originally, like Oregon, we talked about when they were looking at scent mitigation, they were looking at it because politicians were considering what voters were telling them. And so somehow I got invited to be on the 3-person commission to decide how we were going to regulate the scent, which is essentially the VOCs. Yeah. And what I loved about it was the other 2 people was the owner of Fresh Filters, who make carbon filters, and the owner of Can Fans, who make fans that hook to those filters. Just going out on a limb here, I feel as though maybe there's an agenda. So of course, we created indoor agricultural rules around evacuating all of the air through a carbon filter that needed to be changed on a regular basis. And there's better ways to do this. And obviously, I believe that this study, I will work with the OCA and we will attempt to push down this path for something a little more logical. And of course, try to incentivize those that are in the right zones.
And also, too, I mean, this research is a benefit for industry, too, because right now, no one's really quantifying the emissions at the moment. And carbon filters are not one size fits all. If you know the specific molecules that you're trying to capture within that carbon filter, you can actually manipulate the pores within the carbon filter to be just the right size to capture those specific emissions. And so you can be a lot more efficient if you know exactly what you're trying to control. So that's the other piece of this too, is, you know, by capturing these VOCs within the carbon, you're controlling odor, but you're also controlling the VOC, so it's not emitted in the atmosphere, and then you're not getting those ozone impacts as well. So this really puts a new lens on odor mitigation, in that it's not just a nuisance. There is public health impacts, and there's probably going to be some regulatory impacts down the road based on this. So we'll move to fun stuff. So here's a project that I hold near and dear to my heart, and it was in the news a lot lately. So if you guys have heard about it, I'm excited. So, you know, I mentioned before that I specialize in helping both craft brewing and cannabis become more environmentally friendly in Colorado. And I saw this project as an opportunity to bring those two industries together in a way that's economically and environmentally viable. And so what's happening here is, the first picture is at a brewery, a local brewery in Colorado, Denver Beer Company. And those shiny tanks behind us are the fermentation tanks. The last step in the brewing process is where the yeast eat the sugars. They produce alcohol and CO2. We keep the alcohol in the beer. The CO2 just gets vented. This is at every craft brewery out there. CO2 is just vented in large amounts. It's a big source of CO2. Now, at larger scale breweries like Anheuser-Busch and Coors, they capture the CO2 and compress it off the fermentations and reuse it back in the brewing process, because we carbonate our beer with CO2, we pressurize our lines, we use it as void space within the fermentation tanks because oxygen's bad for beer. We use a lot of CO2, but all that CO2 at craft breweries that's used within the process is purchased from an outside supplier. So they purchase CO2 and they generate CO2, right? There's an opportunity here. Then when you look at the cannabis cultivation side, photosynthesis, right? It takes light and it takes CO2. In that process, the plant is taking in that CO2, stripping the carbon, using it as energy for plant growth, right? So it's a carbon sink. It takes in this carbon and it breathes out the oxygen. So with this project, we are capturing CO2 off the brewery's fermentation tanks. Then we're putting it through some really great technology that's provided by Earthly Labs that basically scrubs that CO2 and compresses it, and then we release it within the cultivation environment. So projects gained a lot of press support from the governor. It's been really great all around to work with these folks. Governor Polis actually came and toured both the cultivation facility and the brewery, and did a press release on this, because it's a really great illustration of small businesses coming together to combat climate change, essentially, in a way that's economically feasible for both of them. These projects, both the brewery and the cultivation, have a 22-month ROI that's less than 2 years. It saves during the pilot phase, when we're only feeding one veg room and one flower room. At the cultivation, it saves $1,000 a month right off the bat. Once we get it up to scale at the facility, it'll save the cultivation facility $6,000 a month. That's huge savings. And that's CO2 that would just otherwise be vented from the brewery, and it becomes a revenue stream for the brewery.
Yeah, right? Isn't that exciting?
It can be done.
Sierra Nevada Brewery or Russian River, or there's a lot of different options for California to take on that model, for sure.
Yeah, and since we proved that it's both economically and environmentally feasible, there's no reason that this project can't be repeated. You don't need someone like me in the government pushing and rallying behind this project to get it done. You guys can just do it yourselves. But it helps to have somebody like me rallying to be like, do this. And we hope to see it be a repeatable project. And I think we're running a little short on time, but I wanted to just briefly cover some regulatory lessons from Colorado. And so we've taken a little bit different approach than some of the other states when it comes to environmental efficiencies for the cannabis industry, and that we don't mandate them, we just open up our regulatory structure to allow them to make those more environmentally friendly decisions, because if we force them, they may not be economically viable. And so that's kind of a different philosophy that we have in Colorado. But we allow fiber recovery or an exemption from the 50-50 waste rule if it's going to fiber recovery. As I mentioned in the previous session, if you guys were here, we allow take-back programs at retail facilities for packaging and vape waste. We also allow e-waste recyclers to process marijuana vape cartridges without a special marijuana license, because the intent is recycling. We allow for irrigation of hemp with reclaimed water. That's mostly because hemp is grown outdoors. In an indoor environment, we don't allow that in marijuana because that reclaimed water could aerosolize bacteria and viruses. So can't do it inside. And better access to composting, like I mentioned, allowing the composting truck to pick up your plant waste, put it in the back, and that be the point of compliance for the 50-50 waste rule. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much. So obviously amazing lessons to be learned from Colorado. California is a little slow on the uptake on a lot of those. And, I think that there's certainly ways that we can build on the knowledge of other states. We'd love to hear from folks if you have any specific questions.
Hi. Are you measuring, this is for Kaitlin, are you measuring VOCs at the unit level at grow rooms, or is it estimated based on production and known releases?
That is a great question. So we actually took samples at the exhaust points to measure what is the output for ozone, but then we also took samples within the cultivation facility, in the veg rooms, in the flower rooms, harvesting, processing, so that we can get unique emission factors that kind of add up to that ratio of exhaust, so that, because every facility is going to be different, and we can't just say the exhaust from one facility is going to be the same as another. And so we want to get that relationship established between activities that are happening within the cultivation facility compared to what's at the exhaust point. All of our samples too were taken pre-carbon filtration, because again, carbon filtration is highly dependent on the size of the pores in the filter, what is your HVAC exchange flow rate, if you have it too high, what's the temperature, what's the humidity. It's so variable on what is going to be that carbon filter efficiency. So we only did pre-carbon filtration, basically without any controls. What is the contribution to ozone?
Thanks. And just, is it parts per billion that you measure it in, or?
Depends on where we're at. It's parts per billion in harvesting for sure. It's more parts per million when you're in flower and veg.
I thought this was going to be about growing mediums. So can you all express your opinions or just thoughts on sustainability issues related to peat moss versus cocoa and where that's going?
So we all know that sustainability-wise, cocoa's better than peat moss, right? Like that's kind of been the standard statement for a while, even though we've have some new peat moss beds coming out of Canada that we're saying, no, it's actually just as sustainable. I think that's a debate that can be had over and over. I think for mediums, and we worked a lot at this at Eco before we sold that company, and it's something that I definitely look forward to working with some of our new companies, is the thought process of being able to recycle your soil. Whether you're using peat moss, whether you're buying and mixing your own, whether you're bringing it in through bags, a lot of farms, it's really commonplace that you use this soil, you put it a lot of times in a cloth bag that is thrown away at the end and not cleaned, or if it is going into a pot that's being recycled, they're still taking the dirt and they're dumping it. They're bringing it into landfills, they're composting it, they're 50-50 mixing it. But in reality, with some soil science and some work, if you were on the right property, you could regenerate that soil and continue to reuse it with a good IPM program. And I think that is something that we really need to look at as cultivators in all of our cultivation methodology for sustainability. To say that my cocoa is more sustainable or less sustainable than my peat moss is a moot point if I'm recycling whichever one I have.
Yeah, and I also think, too, the illicit industry plays a really strong role in a lot of the environmental issues that we're seeing in California, because it is unregulated, and we're seeing massive pesticide use and trash and debris and discard, and that soil is often being put into large contractor bags and being brought to the dump. And I totally can understand the dank dirt confusion on that. I just put that together. But yeah, I think that the more regulated the industry, hopefully the less environmental issues you're going to have. But then again, when we look at California, we're not able to regulate any or recycle any packaging yet, and we are going for the most environmentally unfriendly packaging protocols possible. And part of it is because the industry is on the regulated side is really struggling in California. And so a lot of it is just trying to put out fires to stay alive with the hopes of tackling some of these environmental issues in the next few years to come. So, yes. Great.
Okay, I have a question for Gary. So it sounds like you were fairly successful in accommodating the growers in Desert Hot Springs, but if, let's say, Jesse is correct and maybe they aren't the most sustainable business model in longer term, do you have a backup plan? Because I know working with SMUD, they accommodated all these growers in a very specific region and upgraded their distribution facilities, and then those growers, a lot of them are already taken off to go grow in like the Central Coast. So are you planning for that? Do you have any idea?
Yeah, we are looking at that. I can't tell you exactly what that plan is because I'm not involved with it, but our main concern from the very beginning has been stranded assets out in these remote locations. We're kind of in a bind because we're obligated to provide power to anybody that asks, and so we try to do that. One of the ways that we offset that is because it's a high-risk industry, we're allowed to charge them a little bit of the cost up front, so that they have to share in that, but it still leaves us with the potential of stranded assets. The Desert Hot Springs area, Adelanto area, those areas are pretty well built out with other industries that can pick up that load, so we're not too worried about it. There are other areas like California City where there are no other industries, and so that's a concern out there to provide.
We've kind of seen a rise in non-volatile extraction methods and production, especially among smaller to mid-size producers. I wonder if you've taken a look at that at all to assess if they're more environmentally friendly, and why couldn't they be a green zone unto themselves and get some tax breaks to emphasize non-volatile?
Yeah, I think that's a really great idea. And our regulatory structure is constantly evolving, and I would like to see more of an incentive structure. For instance, in the CO2 project, there's actually no tax breaks involved in that at all, and there should be. We should, just like we get tax breaks for solar, we should have, carbon capture tax breaks that are there to incentivize. We should have incentives for these take-back programs that we've now allowed. But what's in it for the dispensary? We're trying to pitch it as, you'll get loyalty points for maybe bringing it back and good customer retention and, good, better relationships. But honestly, I think there should be some tax breaks for that as well. And I think that with cannabis being so new, in Colorado kind of leading the way, we're still kind of fumbling around in the dark and trying to figure out what are those policies. And so, organizations like this and Derek's Resource Innovation Institute and NCIA, all of those bodies out there that are built on bringing us together and bringing government and cultivators into the same room to have these conversations is really, really essential, so that folks like myself can go back to the government and say, hey, this is what industry is asking for. That last slide I landed on, all of the environmental efficiency regulations, those were all new of a January 1st this year, and that was all because our regulated cannabis industry worked with our marijuana enforcement division and made them make those changes. So be a voice that's heard.
I'd love to add kind of a side note on that as well. And one of the challenges that we've had in California is creating a sustainable and workable social equity program. So for lessons to be learned from other states, I would say don't follow California's lack of leadership on that, because we don't have a statewide program that can help folks enter into the industry. There's really high barriers. There's obviously, it's hard to access capital. There's no traditional banking system. So if you're trying to transition, into a legal market, and you're coming from a community that's been severely disadvantaged and targeted by the war on drugs, it's almost insurmountable. And so we have a patchwork of regulation on the local level, and anything that we do in terms of trying to lower barriers to entry often has to go through the legislature. And if you guys have ever dealt with the California legislature, it's a pain in the ass, and it takes a really long time. And so I would say be very thoughtful about, those are things that states can be very proactive on and can learn from the mistakes that are making and probably will continue to make in California. Yeah.
Colorado does not have a social equity program either. And I also want to point out, too, from an environmental justice standpoint, with the way that we zoned cannabis and we forced them all into our industrial zoned areas, those are also our poorest communities. Those are also our sickest communities. Those are also our most diverse communities. Those are our health equity, environmental justice priority areas in our state, and we force the cannabis industry to operate solely in those areas. And so I think that's something interesting to point out when we're talking about social equity.
Question in the back? Yeah.
Hey there. I wanted to say the brewery CO2 to cannabis projects, just about the coolest thing I've ever heard of. So two questions on that. One is there any report or data or something publicly available those of us who are interested in it can learn more from? And then the second is there an estimate of what percentage of the CO2 that's absorbed by the photosynthetic process ends up being re-released via being lit on fire?
Yeah, so we are definitely in the data collection phase of this project right now. We are 1 month into capture. Mr. Jared Polis was so excited about our project, our Colorado governor, that we did a press release after only capturing and successfully doing the project for 1 week. And we have a 3-month pilot time frame where we are collecting data points to beer quality, on plant quality, on logistics of the capture, on the carbon footprint of the trucks going back and forth compared to vehicle miles traveled from a traditional distribution system of having a bunch of CO2 loaded on a truck. It's usually trucked from much farther away because it comes from a power plant. It's a byproduct of combustion. So that's an environmentally friendly practice in itself to capture that CO2 off the power plants. But then we truck it a very long way to get it to both the cultivation and the brewery. And so we want to look at that. And then to get at your question of, what is the CO2 sequestration rate of marijuana in an indoor grow environment? That's something that I would love to study and I want to study, but I cannot get the funding to study it because the ultimate pathway for cannabis is combustion. And so that's something to be aware of, at least from public health and environment, is if we're looking at life cycle analysis, knowing the CO2 sequestration rate of the plants is kind of a moot point if the ultimate pathway is combustion. And so when we look at the environmental benefit of this project, we're mostly focusing on the vehicle miles traveled and reducing that burden there. We know that there is some environmental benefit of taking what would be just vented from the brewery and feeding it to the plants, because it doesn't all end up in combustion, but it could ultimately end up in the landfill as well. Or when we compost plants, I want everyone to be aware of it. Yes, composting is one step above landfill, but when plants biologically break down, they release methane and CO2, and we should be aware of that. Those can be used as commodities if we change the way we manage our waste stream. If we didn't have this 50-50 waste rule, we could have on-site anaerobic digestion of cannabis plant material where we are doing this in basically a black box, breaking down that plant material. Then we can capture the methane as a commodity. Methane is natural gas. We burn it. And also CO2. I mean, that's a commodity as well that we use within our grow rooms and our extraction processes. So that's another opportunity there with the plant waste I think I got a little off track on your questions, but I hope I answered them.
Thanks. This question is for Kaitlin as well. So with the brewery to cannabis project, I was curious, you'd mentioned that some of the larger breweries capture on site and reuse. And I was curious, was there a particular driver for these smaller breweries to capture and then sell off site rather than to reuse on site?
Yeah, so brewery, depending on the size of the brewery, they are going to generate way more CO2 than what they need in their process. And actually, when I ran into Earthly Labs at the Colorado Craft Brewers Conference, and they showed me their technology and their plan to implement it. Their plan was to just implement this technology at breweries to only capture maybe 15 to 20% of their CO2 emissions, because that's all they need as input to the rest of their process. And then they just vent the rest because there's no economic driver there. And when I saw that, my jaw hit the floor. I was like, from an environmental standpoint, capture as much as you can. From an economic standpoint, capture as much as you can and sell it. And so this is really the first time that this has been done. But I'm really excited about this project because I think it's such an inspiration point to start looking at waste as a commodity, to start looking at partnering with different industries, to create independent, localized economies among small businesses. We just cut out a large CO2 company by doing this. That wasn't very happy about it, but it's new ways of thinking, and I think that one thing that I always like to drive home to people is this is true today and every day moving forward. We have the most amount of people on this planet and the least amount of resources we've ever had. We've got to change the way we do things.
Great. Well, I want to thank the experts on this panel for all of your wisdom. Thank you so much for sharing it with everyone today, and we hope you all enjoyed it. Thank you.